I'm Keith Bloomfield, lead developer at Dev9. I've been here for about 3.5 years. I'm leading an Angular project. I've been leading it for about 4 months, and I really have not been doing a lot of AngularJS. Due to the nature of our organization, I've been doing a lot of the integrations, the deployments, the setting up environments. So I hopped on the opportunity to give this discussion to buy myself the free time necessary to do some diving into it. So that's what I've done. I've done some diving, I've learned some things, and also discovered that there is a lot to learn about AngularJS. So I tried to sum up the most important high-level concepts, and we'll be going over those today. So let's get started. Yes, let's get started. So show of hands, are there any traditional front-end developers here, like JavaScript, jQuery? Okay. What about back-end developers, like Java developers? Anyone else? Full stack, business? Excellent. This presentation is for you. Anyone who's using AngularJS at home or work right now? Okay. No questions from those guys. They'll call me out on my lies. Anyone brand new to AngularJS? Good. So, just kidding. You can ask questions. So this is just a small list of things I'm hoping to cover today with our short time together. So let's get started. So AngularJS is a SPA framework. Sorry, it is. It's a SPA framework. And SPA means single page applications with an emphasis on dynamic views. They recommend the client-side model view controller pattern. So I went on to Google and I did an image search for MVC, model view controller images, and I found a whole ton of images and they were all very confusing, but this design pattern is used everywhere. So I want to really quickly go over it. Some of the more useful images. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, a request comes in, hits a controller performs some business logic, saves that data into, like, say, a database, whatever, and then it grabs a view with possibly whatever result comes from that, binds it to it, and gives it back to the user. So congratulations, your item has been added to your cart, essentially. The important part of that is that these two don't know about each other. I'm not going to say they don't care, because I like to think that all technology cares. Another diagram some of you might be familiar with is this one. And so when I'm asking about, like, front-end versus back-end people, your back-end people are usually working out of these areas here. In the model, you have your DAOs, your domain objects. In this controller layer, you have your Spring application, etc., and your back-end people live there. Your front-end people live here, and that's where the beautification of the application lives. That's where the JavaScripts are. The CSS is the browser compatibility. That's where these two worlds have traditionally diverged. So I've been wanting to do a single page application ever since I first used, like, Pandora, ever since I first used Ajax, ever since I first used the XML HTTP request. I've wanted to do it. I never got the opportunity to do it, and it's probably a good thing because there's a lot more to it than I thought. And that's where AngularJS comes in, because they basically take this model and they do that. Bam. They just lay another little MVC right over the top of your MVC. And when I first thought about this, I first saw this, it blew my mind. And I can't process it. It's just warping my brain, because when you think about your traditional MVC pattern, you're talking about routing and requests, and this page leads over to this page, and it goes through this cycle with the server, this round trip. And so this kind of blows my mind, because I'm looking at, like, a single page, and I'm wondering, like, how does that work? I can't put it together. So anytime I get confronted with, like, really confusing code or anything, the first thing I do is I take a look at the pieces. Well, okay. to complain a little bit more, there are a lot of implications to the fact that they did this. And this is why my mind was being blown. Because like, what about history? What about back button? Like, what about all this stuff? I'm freaking out here. So in my effort to simplify my view of this new framework, I'd asked like, well, what can we do with these? Because we have them here, so do we really, like, what can we do with this? Do we necessarily need those bits? So what about that? Like, I've done some work with RESTful services, and what if we just pull them out into a different service? We allow all of the round tripping and the MVC and all the stuff that comes bundled with AngularJS to occur in that single page. And then we just rely on a RESTful service for our data, just straight data. So MVC, MVV, MV star, I like MVW, model view, whatever, and we'll touch on that a little bit mildly as this presentation goes on. Controllers. So I just put this together to a little picture to describe how it does that within a single page. So you have these templates or partials, which are basically fragments of HTML, which get swapped out, assuming you're working with HTML. There are other options, but I'm not going to go there. They're just swapped out through one page. So you really only have one full HTML page, and all the rest of this is just fragments that are swapped out dynamically. So we can go into data binding, expressions, and scopes. I'm going to talk briefly about directives, but I'm not deep diving into it. I just think you need to be familiar with them. So what are directives? They extend the HTML as markers on the DOM. They can be used as attributes, elements, class names, comments. They tell AngularJS's compiler to attach specific behavior to that DOM element, even transform the element and its children. For those of you who are interested in compilation, it basically means like matching the DOM element and then walking through its children and matching those, binding them to the scope. So here's a little, I know none of you can read this, but here's a little code sample of like a most basic Angular app. And so these are your directives. This one right here is just ng app, and it's just being applied as an attribute. Down here is one, it's ng model, and it's another directive, and it's being assigned a value. This is a data binding expression. For those of you who are familiar with like Mustache, it's the same curly brace annotation wrapper on it. So this one, ng app is required. That is what bootstraps your application. It designates the root element. Doesn't necessarily need to be on the HTML tag. It could be somewhere else, but that's where your Angular app hooks in and lives. This one, ng model, it's specifically tailored to bind to inputs, selects, text areas, and more. And then this is evaluated against the scope. So I actually have this example. So I created this project. I don't know if you're all Git users or not, but I created this project, and this is a kind of an app of demos. So yes, Peter. Yeah, last presentation I had a hard time with this, but let's see. So here's our ng model, and here's our ng app. So this is bootstrapping the Angular app. This is binding this input to this. Well, yeah, this is binding to this input, binding it to this scope expression, the scope value, and this here is just echoing it. Well, it's just reading it. So if we look at this, in a browser, it will blow up. Oh no, it wasn't blowing up. It was preparing itself. So see how, like, as I type this, it's updating, like live updating. That's because this thing is bound to the one of these expressions. The bind expression is listening, like observing the scope for changes, and the input one is capturing it, passing it through. So if we look at this, it's also doing it within a class attribute on the same page. So these bind expressions can be applied like anywhere in your HTML page. It could be in your CSS, and you could be dynamically changing the value of it if you so desired.
I'm gonna move up front because I can't see.
Sure. Come on up. So that's binding it to the scope, that's evaluating it. It's all happening magically. So here's an image taken right out of the Angular documentation describing what's going on. This is applying your input to the model, and this is reading it out or binding it. Another thing to know about Angular, about directives, is the only place that touches the DOM is within directives. And that's important because those areas of the app are notoriously difficult to test. We'll talk more about directives later, but first let's talk about scope. So I've been throwing this word around, and this here is a screenshot from the Batarang Chrome plugin, and what it does is it allows you to inspect your scope as you're troubleshooting or developing your app. Scope is the glue between the view and a controller. It refers to your application model. It's arranged hierarchically to mimic the DOM. It can inherit from its parent scope. It can watch expressions and propagate events. So I was initially really concerned about scope because I've had to deal with like a HTTP, like with sessions, server-side sessions, and I've worked on projects where people just kind of put everything on the session, and you run this risk of like side effects when you're just treating this gigantic map as your storage area for everything. Scope behaves, it's still, you still have that risk when dealing with it. That's why it's important to understand it. So there's this notion of a root scope, and that's basically just defined right where you lay that ng app directive. That's right where your root scope is initialized. Lookup proceeds up the scope chain when a variable is not found on the local scope. So if you have a bind expression, it's looking for something on its scope. It doesn't find it, it's going to ask its parent, and that's going to ask its parent all the way up to the root scope. Relying on scope, yes, is risky because the DOM layout is often changed. So depending on how you've developed your app to, like, how you've developed it to rely on this scope, if you're just relying on it at that point in the DOM, then you're running a risk, you're taking a risk, because if you have multiple bind expressions or multiple directives, relying on the scope being at that layer, and then if something comes down, like if a requirement comes down from the business to rearrange your page, then weird stuff happens because they're all assuming that it's right there. You can protect against that by isolating your scope. And we'll briefly look at that later in the discussion. So On your scope object, you have a couple of available functions. I just pulled out two that I was initially fond of. There are a lot of cool ones, but you can ask it to watch something for changes. You can do an apply, which will apply can be used to pull in changes to your DOM that come from outside of Angular. So suppose you're using some other tool like jQuery, you make some modification to the DOM, that's not just going to automatically be pulled into your Angular app. You kind of need to tell it to like walk down through its hierarchy and pull stuff in. Okay, dependency injection. This is everywhere in your Angular app, so it's important to understand how it works. So you have this concept of a module, and a module is just a container for different features of your apps. Has two phases, config and run. Config is the important part. That's where you set up your providers. Providers are responsible for performing, for providing the dependencies that you're using. There's a run phase. I haven't worked with that too much, but it's also available. And that's after this initialization of getting all of your injectables and everything prepared. Then it does this run, and it's for some additional like startup tasks associated with your module. So here's another code example that's too small for most of you to read, but it's so once you include Angular into your app, you have access to this Angular object, and you can define your modules right off that. So we have here Angular module. I'm giving it a name. Here are my dependencies that it's using. Here's the configuration with the injectables. Use as many as you want. You can have config, some config section, .config more. You can only inject providers at this level. Down below the run with the injectables, you can only inject instances there. The providers give you instances. So this is how you can go about like structuring your application, and this is where it becomes very like things become very elegant. You have your root module. It has its dependencies. You can define other modules, and you can orient these towards features, and you can just stick them all together, and then you have this application with these reusable, easily tested modules that can just be applied as needed. Provide. Okay, so this is all confusing. It's an object in the module in the module auto. What is auto? Auto is an implicit module which gets automatically injected to each injector. What is injector? Injector is used to retrieve object instances as defined by the provider, instantiate types, invoke methods, load modules. So basically you have this object and this implicit module which provides you with these injectables that you can use in your app just out of the box. You can write your own, but you get some kind of built into the framework that get you started easily. Provide has some helper methods. These are also exposed on module, provider, constant, value, factory, service. We're gonna dig more into these. So, worth investigating? Provide the decorator. It's cool stuff, but we're not talking about it today. And a pop-up. Where's the controller? Controllers added the DOM using ng controller, among other things, among other ways of getting a controller. The ng controller directive asks the injector to create an instance of the controller and its dependencies. The controller itself never knows about the injector, and loose coupling is maintained. So controllers are not, they're they come and go. They don't remain on the app. They're instantiated and used on demand, and then they go away. So they don't really live in your app, and so therefore they're not. You'll see in the examples that they don't only live in directives. They can be described and kicked up in other places. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly too, because you'll see that it's already taken care of. Dependencies are looked up by name for a provider that satisfies the argument. So when you say app, controller, function, now these are some examples of like objects that are available out of the box. The $scope, $HTTP, just think of these as like the same thing, like app.directive, $HTTP being like baked into Angular itself. So that's all these are. They're just Angular provided objects. So when you're doing dependency injection, you describe your controller and then you follow it up with a function and you put your injectables in there. Order doesn't really matter. Yeah, oh yeah, and that's where these come from. Scope is found in ng module, root scope provider, .rootscope.scope, etc. However, minification ruins it all depending on what type of minifier you're using. However, you can protect against that by wrapping this into an array, which will treat these as arguments to the function and pass them in. However, so that will protect you against minification, except when you do that, order suddenly does matter. But none of this is a problem as long as you're using ngmin, because ngmin will turn this into this. So we'll take this and it will wrap it, it will expand it out, put it in an array, and pass these things as arguments. So now we're back to controllers. Controllers are used to augment the Angular scope. They're attached to the DOM via the ng controller directive, but not only the ng controller directive. They set up the initial state of the scope object, and they add behavior to the scope object. So here's another example. This is your Angular app. So in this case, I'm just saying app because I assigned. You can assign that out to a variable. So this is just like say, well, yeah. It's almost like saying Angular.controller, except it has to be associated with the module. So that's what it looks like in the JavaScript. This is what it looks like in the controller. How about we look at another example? So that's what this one's doing. Inline controller and filter. So here's my ng controller. Now, let's take a look. Can you all see that pretty well? Should I zoom in more? Okay, so here's my controller. And so what this is doing, you can see this, oh, it's including a header. It's doing this, it's using this other directive called ng repeat, which basically acts like an iterator in your page. So in my app.js, here's my home controller. And in it, I'm putting on the scope this array of objects. Pizzas! Because we all love pizza. And so this repeater is just going over each of those entries, right? And then binding the name to the page, and then it's doing it again, another repeat through the ingredients. So notice each pizza has ingredients. It's going through these. So if we look at this on a page, bang, that's all it's doing. There's your pizzas, there's your toppings. There's a second expression here. That's just a throw in a comma if it's not the last item. Not much, huh? Not too impressive. We'll keep going. There's another diagram taken straight from the Angular documentation of the relationship between controller, the scope, and the DOM. So there are certain things that you do not use your controllers to do. Do not use them to manipulate the DOM. Do not use them to format input. You have Angular form controls for that. Don't use them to filter output. You have Angular filters for that. Do not use them to share state across controllers. You have services for that. Don't use them to manage the lifecycle of other components. Okay, so now we'll talk about services. I'm not even going to read that because it's confusing, but we'll figure it out. Service is a stateless injectable argument providing the instance of a function passed to module service. Less confusing, but not much. It's a singleton, it's delayed, lazy loaded, it's not instantiated until it's used, and it's only instantiated once. It's good for cross-app and controller communication, so if you want these controllers to talk to each other, you had best do it through a service. Factories. Another confusing description. Here they are side by side. This is how you would actually set them up. So the main difference between these two is that this one, notice that there's the usage of the this keyword in here, and that's because the service requires like a constructor be passed in, and it creates an object, and it will return an object. The factory does not. Factory just sets up a map, returns a map in this case, with functions on it. All of these things, services, factories, values, constants, they're all just convenience methods for making providers. They all serve to avoid polluting the global namespace. Service versus factory. The difference between a factory and a service is the difference between a function and an object. Factory, you give it a function. Service, you give it a constructor. Further study, some links, because I'm still wrapping my brains around this. I'm not real like deep on JavaScript's prototypal inheritance, and I don't see a need to do it in the application we're using. However, like even though we're using services in many cases, we should just be using factories. Unless we're gonna take advantage of some of those features, then we can do that. Value versus constant. Either can be a primitive, an object, or a function. Constant can be injected into services, controllers, or module configs. However, value can only be injected into services and controllers. So why can't the value be injected into like a module config? And it's because the injector's not been set up yet. Constants are kind of a special case. Since they never change, they don't need to provide a get. They can be looked up directly. Values, they can change, and so they don't fall into the they're not allowed in the module config because in the module config that's where it's preparing all its dependencies, and so injecting something that might not be like determined is just doesn't work. So these are all convenience methods for making providers. They're your training wheels. And I'm on the training wheels right now. You can also create your own providers. And that's kind of taking it to the next level when you're ready. And there's powerful stuff you can do with it. This is the full source of all of those things. This is the provider function. Like, that's all there is to it. Here's the factory function. Here's the service function. And notice within the service function, it's actually calling factory. So the only difference is that it's instantiating like the constructor given to it. Value constant. I mean, that's all those things right there. I took that yesterday. Basically, bottom line is they're all providers. So back to directives and isolate scope. Isolate scope assists in creating reusable components, prevents other components from changing your module state. So it's right here in this little return block. So you provide this scope argument, and you've effectively isolated your scope. What else can you do there? And what is this section like within a directive? Oh, that's easy. Those are the directive definition options. Those are the instructions to the ng compiler. And there are a ton of them. So we're going to go through all of these, and I guarantee, I promise you I'll have you home by breakfast tomorrow. So the first one, restrict. It's a matcher attribute. It matches on the attribute, the element, the class name, any combination of. Default is A. Get comfortable. Bam! I'm not going to go over all these. I'm going to defer to the API. For one, I haven't gone through all these yet. I'm still exploring them. This is my wonderland. And secondly, to cover all of these things in depth would take hours. So unit testing, we use Karma. You can test on real devices. It's a remote control for the browser. Testing framework agnostic. We're using Karma Jasmine right now. It has pretty simple CI integration. It's open source. It's pretty easy to debug from the IDE. Protractor. So, well, let's go back to Karma real quick, because Karma runs really, really quickly. And in the project I'm working on now, and since I don't have it in my examples, is because it relies on like NPM and Grunt. And I'm not, the examples that I have in this app are AngularJS from scripts. So I tried to go so far as like not even to require that you have Git installed on your machine. You can just go to this repo, pull down the zip file, and you have everything you need. There's a lot of code duplication because I basically took one section of a project, copied it all, and then enhanced it, and then did it again and again to make it as user-friendly as possible. Some other examples out there will do it. Will like put a demo app in a repo and then have different branches for different sections. But I'm trying to make this as easy as possible. The project that I'm currently working on, well, I'll get back to that once I get to that section. But the point is, Karma tests run really, really fast, so you can set them up in Grunt, and you can have them run on the fly. As you're writing your code, you can have a watch that every change you make, it runs your tests again and can notify you right away if you've broken something. It's pretty awesome. So Protractor. Protractor is a thin wrapper for WebDriver.js. It has support for cross-browser testing using Selenium WebDriver. Has support for GhostDriver and Phantom.js. That's a work in progress. There is an issue around that right now. I hope to complain about it more soon to you. So it includes WebDriver Manager for drivers, Selenium installation, and updates to both. So since this thing uses Selenium, and you need your drivers, you need your Chrome driver to remote control this browser. It comes with this little utility that will allow you to pull them down and to update them, and it just makes it convenient to use. It also includes Element Explorer for building locators. So it has this other little program in it that you can use to hook into your page, and it will give you suggestions for the kind of locators you're trying to build. So our testers can use this, sometimes do use this to determine what kind of location strategy will work for them. Like they're trying to figure out how can I access this element, and they can mess with it through this little utility, which allows them to do it like right then and there. And then once they come up with the right locator, then they just pull that out, put it into their test. It integrates with Sauce Labs, and it's easy enough to port over to Browser Stack. So we have a pretty long history with Sauce Labs. We're evaluating Browser Stack as another option, and it has the straightforward integration with Sauce Labs. Like you just give it the user, the account identifier and the key, and you're up and running. But not much if you're using Browser Stack. Not much to switch over. So none of you can read this either, but I'll explain it. It recommends the page object model design pattern for testing. So these are your HTML pages that you're testing. These are page objects that are testing against them. So when you're using this design pattern, you have these page objects, and the page objects have all the the knowledge of the actual pages you're testing. And then they expose functions to your tests that are readable and understandable. So your test might have something like navigate to this page, log in, add something to the cart, etc., etc. So it's a very useful pattern. I haven't found anything more effective for end-to-end testing because as your developers are changing the app, they're changing the DOM, your tests are breaking, you can update them in the page objects, and your tests are entirely separate from that. So, and furthermore, I think, in my opinion, it makes it a lot more readable. You could take this to a business person and they could read through these steps and actually see what the test is doing. So it's about as close as you can get to manual reproduction steps in case an actual bug comes out. You also have the option with Protractor to tap into features of WebDriver.js. They have this this other control flow object where you can set it up and you can prepare your functions and then you can go through it sequentially as opposed to like a Jasmine oriented approach where you use like describes and promises. Continuous integration. So I'm going to describe how we are dealing with our AngularJS app right now. And so what we're using is Jenkins with the Node plugin. Unit tests are run with via Grunt and Karma. The IDE tests are still a work in progress, as I was alluding to earlier. So what we did for our IDE tests is I set up a couple little jobs, and they rely on npm concurrent, connect, and scripts for setup, watch, and teardown. So since JavaScript Node is a single-threaded language, what I do is I use this. There's a concurrent job to spin up two different tasks. One will start the app server and deploy the Angular app. It goes through the full process, builds it, lints it, deploys it, and then the second one will run protractor tests against that. And so once the protractor tests are done, then it brings it all down. So I whipped this together like in a couple days, and the estets are still using it. So that's so far so good. However, it's awaiting reintroduction of timing in Jasmine for PhantomJS tests. So what we're hoping to do next is separate our browser-based tests from our PhantomJS tests, like just straight functionality from browser compatibility. But there's a bug I believe it's in Jasmine. It's a timing issue. There's a feature request out for it, so it's on hold for right now. We're still awaiting we're not really awaiting our credentials. There's some networking issues, but availability exposing tunneling issues right now that we're held up on for cloud-based testing. Real-world challenges. So these are similar to those of all large projects. Discovering and establishing best practices amongst contributors. So we all came into this. There were some people with some degree of AngularJS knowledge, and some of us who, I guess our skill sets were intermixed, and there were a lot of technologies baked in. So we're all ramping up on it and discovering something, coming up with like the best pattern, and driving it out across everybody is a challenge. Directory structures, file taxonomy, refactoring with project growth. That's another thing. So I'll try to show you in my examples, if time allows, how over time I restructured an application to focus on features instead of just having like tests, controllers, services, like specific directories. Keeping libraries up to date can be a challenge. Keeping Bower in the loop Right now, we're still ramping up on Bower, and it's currently locked down until one of us deep dives into it and determines how to better suit it to work with our application. So to Bower is a dependency management tool that does a lot of magic things, but if you don't understand it, you're just using it, it can also kind of take you run your project off the rails by upgrading a library that you were not ready to rev. Rediscovery of conveniences found in mature frameworks. So refactoring a lot of the tools that I've used, like IDE features to deal with to better manage a Java project, have needed to be rediscovered with an Angular project, or they're still in discovery. Multiple solutions, evaluation, and selection. So there's like 10 ways to solve every problem you run into. Maybe 3 of those will bring everything just crashing down at some point or another. 2 of them are like the most beautiful, elegant code you've ever seen, and then the other 5 are kind of meh, they're all right. No side effects. Adjustments for everybody. So we've all had to ramp up on the new framework and concepts. We've had some challenges around continuous delivery and deployment, preparing our binary artifacts, externalizing the configuration, because Grunt has this idea of like doing all that for you. And traditionally what you do is you have like an ops person, and they get your artifact and they have a config that sits on their machine, and they just grab your artifact and they deploy it. In this case, it comes in all as one package. And so we've had to put a little more effort into preserving that externalized configuration. Various tools, lots of tools in motion. Grunt, Node, NPM, Bower, CSS compilers, Yeoman. There's a lot. There are a lot of rabbit holes to dive into when working on one of these projects. Challenges to the front-end veterans, new conventions, structures, design patterns. It's not just jQuery, JavaScript, and CSS anymore. You have more responsibility for application architecture. So your whole app is in there. That's a lot different than just shuffling around DOM elements and everything. That's your whole app. So it's imperative that you understand your design patterns, your data structures, how these things hook in together, and that has affected some of our people who come from like a background of just decorating things and making them work with specific browsers. Challenges to backend veterans: using JavaScript as a primary language, dealing with callbacks, promises, debugging, refactoring. UX issues, trying to make your app responsive, making it work on all these different browsers and mobile devices. Coordination with the REST APIs and the content delivery service. So in our case, we're dealing with something that was formerly a web application. That first diagram we saw, the MVC with the Spring app and the views layer and the database, and now we're in the process of building out these REST APIs and having this a new content delivery service. So we're actively coordinating with these different teams to make sure these things are in sync, to make sure that the network calls we're making are minimized, ensuring that we don't have too much bloat in our app. So some of the gotchas we've experienced so far: potential for memory leaks, weird behavior with scope misuse. So if you just treat scope as like, hey, it's just a map, just put it in there and then it'll be there, you're gonna have a hard time, because it's very easy to put too much in there, or for it to misbehave in there. So you kind of need to understand how it's hierarchical structure and how things propagate down, and how to isolate them, and how they talk to each other. Bower gone wild, that's been an issue for us because we had Bower and none of us have dived in. I've just started digging into it, and I think that there's a lot of potential there, but for now it's in prison. Like we're manually dealing with the revisioning of libraries, addition of new libraries. Dependency additions and revisions. So there's that is a NPM thing specifically. So we have some people who are not familiar with NPM, which is a node package manager. So every now and then somebody will introduce a new library, and then somebody else will be like, "Oh, none of my stuff works," and it's like, yeah, just do an NPM install. Like grab those dependencies, and then you're good. Library and dependency bloat. So we're actively working to make sure that our deployable minified artifacts are as small as possible. That means we're not using jQuery because it's a pretty big library. We're trying to keep things small so that they will perform well, like on mobile devices or slower devices, etc. And then, yeah, the issues and feature requests in Angular and integrated libraries and tools. So there are just all these different moving parts. There are some Angular features that are still being baked at this moment. And if you look at like these projects in GitHub and you see just tons of pull requests, tons of issues. It's really the jump in popularity has just caused things to get really, really crazy. So they're being dealt with as quickly as possible, but people are finding new issues. They're, I don't know, teasing them out. Other things are changing. Yeah, the usual stuff. Tool support, IDEs and refactorings. And refactoring. So I'm using IntelliJ. A lot of people use WebStorm. They're both kind of, WebStorm is basically a fork off of IntelliJ. I've seen bugs show up in both at the same time, so I think they still have a lot in common. A lot of people use Sublime Text. You can use Vim, NetBeans, Visual Studio. Look for the plugins. There are really useful plugins for all of these things. Miscellaneous open source frameworks. Yeoman. So Yeoman is a combination of Yo, Grunt, Bower, plus generators. I recommend you go and try this out. It's very straightforward. It's well documented. This will give you like with a couple commands can give you a production ready hello world, but it gives you a gigantic app with all this stuff, all these different configs and files, and so that's what we started out with on my team. We started with a Yeoman generated project, and we were relying on generators to create new directives. But over time, I started to get concerned that we weren't really diving into this framework and understanding how all these things fit together, because people were starting to complain like, hey, I used the generator, I did a directive, and I'm trying to get it to share scope with this thing, and it's just not working. I hate AngularJS. So, or therefore I hate it. Okay, so this is a good one to get, like if you're familiar with NPM, to have something and have a task that you can run that is like watching and up, like dynamically reloading and running tests and giving you examples of unit tests, probably not end-to-end tests, but it's a nice tool to play around with. There are lots of grunt plugins out there. There are lots of NPM packages. Just about, I mean, a lot of the issues I ran into is like, oh yeah, hey, should I code this from scratch or should I just go out to NPM and look for it? Bam, there it is. Like cache busting. Okay, done. Battering is a plugin for Chrome. It's nice. It allows you to inspect the scopes, expressions, does a few other things, and then just the browser web developer console. You can just tap right into this stuff from your browser. Static code analysis, we use JS Hint. We're using the Grunt library for that, which is just a pass-through. This will enforce your code quality using rules. So you give them the set of rules in the config, you just put them in there, and it will, while you're watching your code changes, it'll bark at you the moment you violate a code quality rule. Configure tasks and Grunt pass directly to JS Hint. It's customizable. You can customize your reporter output, your options, globals. You can put in ignores for specific warnings if you really want to do that and you want to keep that rule, but you want to ignore like this specific warning, you can ignore it. Yeah, linting before and after concatenating files. Cool stuff.
I can't read that one at all.
This one? So this is code coverage. So this is just another library. This is a library that we're using for. Oh, wait. You mean you can't read that line right there? But it's perfectly legible. Okay. So we're using this tool called Karma Coverage, and I was like, hey, let's check out code coverage. Just pull in this tool. Hey, look, you can configure it to output like its reports in Cobertura. Hey, let's put it into Jenkins. Sure. So we've integrated it into Jenkins. So it's, with every build, we get this report of. So this is our code coverage report, just to see, like, we're striving for. I think we're at around 80% right now. This is just our test result trend. We also have that reporting out in Jenkins, and then this is another our code coverage trend, which I think is just starting to inch its way up as of today, last couple days. I'll share these slides out. I know you can't read them. There are a lot of links in them. They actually already are available. I'll share with you the link for those. Resources for learning. Stack Overflow is your most reliable place to go. There are a lot of there is a lot of documentation about this framework on the web. There are a lot of tutorials. AngularJS.org. They have some videos on there. You have the API docs. They're pretty thorough. GitHub projects. Egghead.io. I put this on here and then I took it off because I was offended that they would ask me for money, like a subscription, $15 a month, so much money. And then I finally ponied up the money, and they just have a ton of very useful videos, like very in-depth, understandable videos they walk through. So money well spent for sure. They have a style guide, and this talks about like best approaches for naming your directives, your services, your for structuring your application and for placing things. This is the tutorial I was referring to earlier, where it's a phone cat, it's a cell phone application. It's just a test app where you can evaluate cell phones, but it's set up in like a Git repo where every branch is like a different step in the tutorial. It's a fun one to go through, and it's got tests and everything baked into it. This one, the Los Techies, they have some really useful tutorials there. Really useful articles there that dive into things and explain them in such a way that, like, what is transclusion? I don't know. It reminds me of like a piece of bread dipping in fondue, and yeah, it's kind of like that. So questions, first off, can you read those? So
Are you going to email this out, or will you have to write it down?
I can email it. I can add it to the what are we using? Meetup. So so these slides are here. These demo examples are here. How are we doing on time? I want to see. It's 4:30. So I have some more. So this project is that second link, and you can pull it down. You can pull it down as a zip. I have a README file that describes what each section is doing. It's another library called UI Router that has just lots of really cool functionality features to it. So, does anyone have any questions right off the bat? Question?
So one of the things you mentioned is that you don't use jQuery in some of the projects because you're trying to keep the size of the project down.
Yep.
Does that mean you can use, or does that mean Angular has enough functionality that jQuery does?
It does. It comes bundled with a lighter version of jQuery. It's called JQ Lite, and that allows you to do some things that jQuery does, but not all of them.
What would you want to do? Seems like you should use that,
People, yeah. Well, we're trying to stick to it, but I've also seen other successful organizations include. They were using jQuery as like they have like a view-based, or it's like a role-based view control, view management. So depending on what the user, what type of role they're given, or their what is it? Is it authentication, authorization? I always confuse those two, but whatever kind of role they have, they were using jQuery to determine what they could see. However, we're doing the same thing. We have we have some backend auth, and we're using UI router for it. So we've managed to solve the same problem without having to pull in jQuery. So I hope that's what you should do, because that's what we're trying to do. Yep. Okay.
Pausing it and whatever, crazy goodness. So I'm not a. I put my hand up earlier on to say that I was a full stack developer.
Okay.
Looking at the huge ecosystem around Angular,
Mm-hmm.
I think I should have not put my hand up. How much? I mean, if I'm going to hire someone to, we want to be using AngularJS, Kendo UI, which is built from scratch.
Uh-huh.
How much experience of using JavaScript do you expect someone to need to have to be able to get all this?
I don't know if you can measure that in years, because when I took, so a couple months ago, I took the Node.js MongoDB for Node developers class, right? And it said, well, like, the prerequisite for that class was, hey, you have to have JavaScript experience. Well, hey, I've been using JavaScript in the browser for years. I'm a sure fit. And then I go into this class, and they're presenting, they're like, okay, and some of their problems were actually related to Node. So I ended up spending a lot more time solving those problems by diving into Node. So it's so there's a big difference between like using JavaScript in the browser to fulfill some kind of like client-side need, and using JavaScript like within the context of a full JavaScript server. So I guess if I was personally, when I'm looking for Angular people, I lean more towards the core CS background, so that they understand like their data, so they understand their algorithms, their data structures. So when I'm trying to translate some term and being like, this is a and directives are crazy, but I of the things that can be expressed in design patterns, I can make it easier for them to be like, yes, it's just using this. This is just a pub sub communication right here. So.
Yeah, I'll add to that. So the rapid being background really made me cry.
Yeah.
So if you break it out in a couple pieces, so the just notion of having the data in the views, that's kind of like when they call that. Where I see a lot of people struggle is the terminology in Angular makes it sound a lot worse than it is. So
Yep.
Directives, transclusion, you start.
Yep. Yep.
And so when you back then, you're like, okay, well, all a directive is just saying I'm going to add something to one of these HTML. You start building an Angular thing, you wind up with something where all the tags just look like these custom little tags. The controllers, if you've been doing Java,
Yeah.
long time, so you're injecting. That's where the testability comes in. Awesome, because now I have a thing where I can inject a couple things with Angular and test it. Services, you've been factoring business logic out of controllers for years, right? So all those things together as a Java developer, the ecosystem and the JavaScript syntax, the rigorous is the hard part to get through. But the terminology is really more of like if I say transclusion, you go, if I say you just want to input a little snippet of a view, oh, exactly what that is. That's all transclusion. Directive sounds like this crazy thing.
Well.
Come up with sort of like a crash course. This is all the terminology, these are how they translate, and it's a lot easier to get a person with a Java background into this. Where I see people having a lot of trouble with they think, oh, this is like, adding a focus into on load or something, and it's like done, right? No, this is if you look at these project structure on the side, you can't really see.
Oh yeah, yeah. This is after the refactoring. So initially I was breaking apart by like controllers, templates, my app, and then later I switched it to like common. And this is where I keep my directives, and then I have daily deals. Direct. Oh yeah, hey, let's look at the app. I've been doing some work on this. I want you to see.
Actually run it.
Yeah, it's kind of slow here. Probably because it's recording. Walt's Pizza. So this is what it became. So here's an example of like data sharing between controllers. These are three different controllers. They're sharing a service, and each one is decorating it. These are different directives, and these are I believe these are using transclusion. They're passing in an attribute, and it's wrapping it in this wonderful little red box. I wanted to show you another one. Oh yeah, here's a drag and drop directive. Very slow here. Here's some more directives wrapping these. There's a debug. What did I want to? Where is this? Okay, so this is what we mean by like dynamic views, right? So this one right here. Can you read any of this? Okay, so there's this guy Walt. He's the owner of the pizza place. He experienced these life events, and from this controller, it puts these life events on a scope. Washed his car and discovered a new pizza recipe. Then there's another controller for his month's events. And during the month, he grew a beard, got stung by a bee, addressed his son as Flynn. And then there's day events. And these don't do anything. They just read the values off the scope. So if you notice this, these are the same things. These are the same things. They're reading the exact same values. When you look at the code, you'll see them just pulling out their Walt events is what they're called. But you'll notice that these last ones are different. Any ideas why that is? I will tell you. It's because there's a relationship between the scope and the DOM, and these are sibling elements, right? So this one, when it doesn't find anything on the scope, it looks up to its parent. So that's why it gets these, right? Now these are nested. So boom, boom, boom. This one doesn't find its stuff, it looks up at this one. So
All of that stuff, like the regular JavaScript app is just having load event. If a Java developer and said you have all this background, already complex apps, and you just think that JavaScript will make it easier, but you probably need factor or computer science majors straight out of college.
well, and even that. I mean, you just need to like try to look for an individual who's interested in like deep diving into things because Angular is like broad and very complex, and so you go through it's described as having like a hockey stick learning curve. Like right off the bat, you're like, all right, I mastered this, I'm going, and then you're like, oh, what is all this? And it's more of like a upward wave. It's like, I love it. Oh, it sucks. I found it out. I love it. So you have to continually dive into these features of it. And so as long as you have somebody who's willing to do that, who's interested in doing that, who's like, hey, I'm not comfortable. I don't feel like because it seems like for me, I had a pretty bad feeling right off the bat that I didn't know what all this stuff was doing. Like, what is a bower.cc file? Like, why is it there? I don't know. What is .js hint? Like, what are all these things that Yeoman generated? What do they do? And do I need them? And then I start diving into each one, and I'm like, oh my god! Like the difference between Bootstrap and Angular Bootstrap is entirely different. They both do two totally different things. So as long as you can find people who are interested and willing to dive in and figure this stuff out and train one another, then it's good. But if you take someone who's like, my top skill is jQuery, and I am only going to do jQuery, then they're going to fight with it and try as hard as they can to do it in jQuery, and they're going to fight the framework. So you got to find people who embrace the framework.
We actually I went to the show, and a lot of people were showing that the only tab that the
Express,
Mongo Express,
Angular, Node.
And so I'll talk to kids. There was this one kid who was like 23, 24, and just working in this field for 2 years. Java and some JavaScript stuff, and he looks at me and goes, well, I'm mostly interested in technology that is forward, so I'm not interested in Java stuff. So it's like, way to shiv a little bit, right? The thing is that and when you talk about somebody fresh out of school, you're going to have to teach them source control, you're going to have to, like, he was talking about code coverage, right? So why would a kid out of school, and I could be wrong, maybe the CS programs have changed a lot, but I don't think you're going to talk through things like this where it's doing testing and
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate the time because I realize the answer to this question may not be relevant to everyone.
No, it is. I mean, I get that question a lot from Dev9 too. Like, what should we be looking for? Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Speaking of frameworks, I was wondering, what is your case for using AngularJS versus one of the other MVC platforms, Rails, Django, whatever, Java as the case? It seems like a similar structure, and I can see the advantages, I can see disadvantages. So I'm wondering what is the case you would make with a client? Why do you want to use Angular versus one of the other platforms?
I haven't used Rails, Django. I know that a lot of the features from Angular were borrowed from Rails.
But you're familiar with MVC, the server-side MVC.
Yeah. So why use this? It's faster. It's faster. I mean, why you don't need to make that full HTTP round trip. If you can pull all of that into your app, it's going to and rely only on the data, like the actual application data, then it's just it just behaves a lot faster.
But it also makes it more fragile. It's also only faster if your browser has enough memory to run what you're running.
Sure, yeah, it's true. You could if the size of what you're putting into the browser is too much, then yes, that's true. Then it might slow things down.
I sort of see some applications being better suited for it than others. I'm sort of curious how you approach it.
Another benefit would be on the back end, all you need is data. So you can develop your front end without
Yes, right,
really caring
right,
about what's on the back end.
right.
That's the thing. You still have to develop backend. You still have the models to go and
Yep.
It's certainly easier to test something as a service. You make a RESTful call and you get the response, right? The data
Yeah.
versus you have to bring up inside an app and have to be selected.
Yeah.
You still have to do that here because you have to end up testing.
No. Good point. Good point, Peter. That's very important.
Did you show that, sir?
No. I do have another app that. Okay, so this one that I created has no grunt, no npm, no nothing, right? But I might have another. Let's see. Yeah. But that is an important point. Is that it allows different teams to work in parallel. So you can be developing out, like building out your back, and that's what we're doing right now. Is we have the RESTful services. That team is building out that. We have the content delivery service. They're doing their thing, and we're doing our stuff. And if we don't have it available, we can mock it out right there. And then once they're ready to integrate, we just integrate.
Part of my build test cases that generate the JSON from data set that I'm looking at. And then I can take those files and I put them in the directory and those directories and actually take those files and I can put them out and drop them into my JavaScript project. And then I have everything that available. One thing is Angular has amazing right? I can do things like I can say here's a service that I want to define that is going to depend on an HTTP object. It's going to go out and fetch JSON data or something. So, and then a service object. And I can do things like say, on that certain request, and then I can respond to those myself and other requests. So what I want to mock out. with those little objects as things not
It does really feel like Angular is where everyone's landed. Like, okay, now we're going to put the buildings out into full mature ecosystem of big serious companies who worry about these things, but whereas perhaps those who might make it. So, background and Angular.
awesome. So I go to Indeed.com, so then Indeed.com, what this is the search box, you can pop in the technology, which, so you can say, how many back applications are there, so I use that to like, process the technology, so I'm going to find the research tools. So one of the other pieces, the grant serve thing, so that grant serve.
Yeah, it is. I'm messing with it right now.
Yeah, so watch. If you try to speak it and shut and hit save in your IDE.
You don't see that. Let me go back to make some changes. Yeah, so this is actually reading off a template. Yeah, so it's watching my code changes, so I can just make changes, save. It goes through the full process, like linting, deploying. So it's actually it makes for a very rapid development platform, right? Yeah, and you can use Grunt to lay out all these tasks. So for our deployment, we like lint it, concatenate it, minify it, compile the CSS, compress it, version it, and then it's picked up by Jenkins, bundled into an RPM, because we're actually using Apache as our web server, because it's just there, and we're using RPMs for everything else. So we're just making it easier for the ops team. But yeah, this is cool. This is why I was saying Yeoman, because this is just, I just went to Yeoman, followed the steps, grabbed the Angular generator, got this project, and you can see there's just a whole ton of, it just generated all this stuff, all these files. And then I just did a grunt serve, and I can go in here and just edit this stuff. And doing a grunt serve, it triggers a watch, so every time I make a code edit and I save it, then it just, boom, it just updates. So less, I believe. I'm not sure which one comes. I'm pretty sure it's less out of the box.
So you get a full workflow for editing and then saving and then live refresh all of it from the front. So you're talking about maturity frameworks. Right now, I think the last week is pilot default recommended. If you have a look at the very opinionated layout, that's sort of, it's more like good luck.
Sorry, Yeoman will ask you if you want less or SAS, and then it will bake it in, I believe. Yeah. Yep. Just like a guard. Yep. Any other? Oh yeah.
Look it up. There's 1,098 open issues. This one's 3 years old. And that's something that concerns me.
For in what?
For the Angular.
There's a okay. Yep.
Open issues. And that's something that concerns me.
How many pull requests are there? Also. Yeah.
1,228.
Yeah. Yeah. I've noticed that they're.
It's intense, but that's still a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're pretty wacky too. Like when you start reading them.
Yep. Yeah, that's what happened. I mean, that's kind of what happens when something takes off as quickly as it does, and it's got how many contributors? Like 23 or something on the main team. I don't. Yeah.
But yeah, I bet it's gonna keep going up. This kid's just keep
As the scope of features expands, Yeah, I'm sure everyone was
All right, is that it? Thank you.